In this afternoon's program, we'll watch 1960s Best Picture winner, director Billy Wilder's masterful comedy drama, The Apartment, starring Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. A major influence on the recent TV series Mad Men, The Apartment's depiction of sex, love, and corruption in the world of corporate America is funny, moving, and unmistakably adult. Our presenter, Stephen C. Smith, is an award-winning biographer. You have a fan, Stephen? 4-time Emmy-nominated producer and 16-time Telly Award winner. His over 200 documentaries include collaborations with Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, Julie Andrews, Stephen Sondheim, Harrison Ford, and Sidney Poitier. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Stephen C. Smith.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you. I hope I didn't.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you, Abe, and thank you to the library. I'm just curious, and I'm delighted we have such a good attendance today on a bit of a cloudy day. How many people were able to make it for all 3 weeks of this series by a show of hands? Well, that's good. Thank you. And for those who didn't, I'm happy to report that in time, they will all be available for viewing on the library's fantastic YouTube channel. And as is true of the other wonderful speakers they have here. So I encourage you to visit that site. It's just full of great people speaking about amazing topics. Well, I'm going to keep this relatively short since our film is a little longer today, but I just wanted to remind everyone that we've gone through a journey that began in the 20s when things were wild in Hollywood, when there wasn't censorship and the government might be moving in. Hollywood preempted that by creating the production code, something written in 1930, rules that were not really followed for a while until a man named Joseph Breen came in and forced Hollywood to enforce those rules. So this was self-censorship. The government wasn't involved in Hollywood movies, and Breen, however, made all the studios really follow those strict rules. And things stayed pretty much status quo that way until the mid-1940s, and that's where we'll pick up our story. World War II is over. GIs are returning home, and they are starting families in a new post-war invention, the suburbs. Now, for a couple of years, movies do better than ever. Everyone's going to the movies. But then came something called television. And tell me if the following scenario sounds familiar. It became far easier to stay home and watch something on a screen than go out and spend all that money to go to a local theater. Not saying it's right or wrong, but that's what happened. Well, the war had also changed the perspectives of millions of Americans, probably most, if not all Americans, whether they served abroad and had seen death up close, or if they had experienced loss or heard about the terrible crimes that happened during the war. Americans, like all citizens of the world, were different people after World War II. And in Europe, one result was that filmmakers began to make more realistic movies. They were often shot on real locations, sometimes with non-professional actors in the leads, and this trend was called neorealism, and Hollywood paid attention to that, and it influenced a lot of movie makers. After the war, it became common, and I love this picture, it's fun to see it on a big screen. It became common after the war for studio movies, or at least parts of those movies, to be shot on location, giving a greater sense of realism than all the rear screen projection that moviegoers had gotten used to in the 30s and 40s. And the stories that went with these films were often more adult. 1947's Best Picture winner, Gentleman's Agreement, faced head-on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. And in 1953, another Best Picture winner, From Here to Eternity, dared to bring the roughest, most scandalous novel of its time to the screen with far more frankness than usually allowed. It is true that the novel's many four-letter words, including the big one, which is in that book a lot, those had to be left out. But the film was critical of the military, something not done at the time. It sympathetically portrayed an adulterous relationship that went against the code, and after much haggling with the censors, it was made and rewarded with huge box office returns and several awards. Now, around this time, Hollywood censorship faced another blow. In the early 1950s, the Italian film Amore, directed by Roberto Rossellini, was the subject of a major court case in America, because Rossellini's film contained within it a segment called The Miracle. And in The Miracle, a man named, now see if you can see why anyone might object to this in America in the early 50s. In the Miracle, a man named St. Joseph impregnates a troubled young woman who believes that she is the Virgin Mary. Well, there were plenty of protesters when that film screened at an art house in New York. And it's interesting that some of the strictest censorship was in New York. Well, those protests convinced the New York Censor Board to rescind its license that had allowed Amore to be shown. But the movie's distributor sued the Censor Board, saying that their ban violated the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1952, the Supreme Court sided with the distributor, ruling that movies were indeed covered by free speech. That was an important victory, but it did not immediately change the Hollywood system, because studio executives liked having their internal censorship board, the Hays Code, run by Joseph Breen, since it kept government out of their business, and it mostly kept the local censor boards, like that one in New York, off of their backs. But there were directors who kept pushing things, and among the boldest was this man, Austrian-born Otto Preminger. Preminger had already made some terrific movies like the film noir classic Laura. By the 1950s, he was determined to bring more adult content to American movie screens. And when the production code censors told him that he could not use the word virgin in his rather innocuous comedy, The Moon is Blue, well, Preminger just ignored the censors, and he used the word virgin anyway. And the censors blinked. The word stayed in the movie, and the movie was approved for release by the Production Code Office, even though it was banned in Boston. Now, it may not be a coincidence that after that film's release, and the Best Picture win from For Here to Eternity, and all the things I've been telling you about, after all of that, censor czar Joseph Breen decided to retire in 1954 after running the production code with an iron fist for exactly 20 years. His successor was this man, Geoffrey Sherlock, a British-born executive who was more liberal in his attitudes than Breen had been. And when Otto Preminger told Sherlock that he now wanted to make a film based on the book The Man with the Golden Arm, a book about drug addiction, Sherlock supported him, even though the code banned stories that showed illegal drugs being used or talked about how they were bought and sold. So movie by movie, Otto Preminger was leading the battle to loosen up those strict rules of the 1930 production code. Another great one is Anatomy of a Murder, which you may have seen, which I recommend. By the mid-1950s, there were other social forces too big to ignore, and one had a name, Brigitte Bardot. The films that she was making and others in France were much more adult and sexually explicit, and when European films like hers began to be screened in America, Hollywood movie makers began pushing the envelope further. Well, by the 1960s, U.S. studios were releasing movies, both made in America and from abroad, movies that had flashes of nudity, like 1966's Blow Up, or very adult language, like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? That film starred Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, who took home a Best Actress Oscar, and that movie was a critical and commercial success. Its frankness in 1966 meant that the production code by then really existed in name only. But studios knew that they needed some kind of regulatory system. And in 1968, they came up with what has proven to be a successful replacement, all in all, for the code, and that would be the rating system, which we still have today. Now, if you look at these, you can see that the list, the specific ratings have changed a little over the years. I remember the GP rating, that was the first one to go. And originally, an X rating was intended for movies that had very mature content, but were legitimate studio films. But it wasn't long before the X rating was quickly co-opted by makers of pornography, which is the reason that very few American movies get a rating above an R these days. Well, to end our series, I've chosen a movie that comes from the last years of the production code, 1960's Best Picture winner, as Christine mentioned, The Apartment. It was directed and co-written by someone who had been fighting the censors ever since he arrived in Hollywood from Berlin in the 1930s, Billy Wilder. In 1944, Wilder directed Double Indemnity. Some of you may have joined me for that when I screened it here. It was based on a novel that Hollywood had been afraid to film for 8 years because it focused on two sympathetic murderers, and it showed in detail the methods of their murder, which the code strictly forbade. But Billy Wilder eventually convinced the censors to let him make the film since the killers were punished in the end. Well, after that success, Wilder teamed up twice with a star that even Joseph Breen couldn't contain, Marilyn Monroe. She starred in the Billy Wilder movies The 7-Year Itch, with its famous subway grate scene, and then in 1959, Some Like It Hot, in which Marilyn's costumes were so sheer, she almost showed as much as she had in that photo that became Playboy's first centerfold in 1953. And yes, Playboy was another gut punch to the production code in that decade. Well, Billy Wilder later said that he got the idea for The Apartment after seeing the 1945 British film Brief Encounter, one of my favorite movies, directed by David Lean and written by Noel Coward. And it's a touching story about two people, both married to someone else, and they meet and fall in love. And I won't say too much, but 2/3 of the way in the story, they decide to meet at the apartment of a friend of the man. And Billy Wilder watched this movie, and being Billy Wilder, he had a very Billy Wilder thought. He thought, what about that guy they kicked out, whose apartment it was that they were going to use? What happened to him? And maybe he had a racket where all of his friends would come over and they'd leave their wives or whatever and meet their mistresses. Wouldn't that be a good movie? Well, it was a good idea, not at the right time, because in 1945, not a chance would that be made. But for all the reasons I've been explaining today, by 1960, it was the right time. And he got a first-rate cast for this film that includes, as you see, Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine, and my favorite movie of hers, and Fred MacMurray. I'll have a little more to say about him later. And as Christina mentioned earlier, this is a film that is also critical of big business, of corporate America, you might even say of certain aspects of America in general, as an outsider, a European like Billy Wilder and his partner I.A.L. Diamond could do. And yes, definitely a big influence on Mad Men. The only other thing I'll say, because it comes early in the movie and it's fun, is that the movie has incredible sets by the great Alexander Trauner. And this has nothing to do with censorship, but it's fun because you will see how many co-workers Jack Lemmon's character has. And I don't think it's spoiling too much to say that, yes, it was a big set, but to give it the maximum sense of density of people, Alexander Trauner had smaller and smaller people behind Jack Lemmon until there were children in the back. So please stick around after the movie, which is in gorgeous widescreen, and I very much look forward to your thoughts on The Apartment. Thank you. In 1984, there was a Billy Wilder Film Festival when I was going to college at USC, and I got to interview Billy Wilder. And I remember the night of The Apartment, Fred MacMurray was also there, and he spoke after the movie. And he talked about the fact that he was not supposed to be in this film. An actor named Paul Douglas was cast in the role of Sheldrake, and unfortunately, Paul Douglas had a fatal heart attack in 1959, just before filming. Well, Billy Wilder had worked with Fred MacMurray on another movie I think you've probably seen, Double Indemnity. And at that time, Fred MacMurray was best known for light romantic comedies and really had to be talked into playing the role of Walter Neff in Double Indemnity by Billy Wilder. Turned out to be a great success. So years later, Fred MacMurray has started making Disney films. He had just made The Absent-Minded Professor and things like that. And Billy Wilder said, Fred, we've got a problem. Paul Douglas isn't going to play that part, and I want you to play Sheldrake. So Fred MacMurray once again said, I don't think it's a good idea for my career, Billy, but he talked him into it and gave, a wonderfully cold, callous, perfect performance. But once Fred MacMurray was out and a woman was there and suddenly started hitting him with her purse, and she was furious because she had taken her young daughter to see The Apartment since it was a Fred MacMurray movie. So, a few hits from a purse and the two best movie roles he ever had. I think it's a worthwhile trade-off. One last thought. This was made in 1960, and Billy Wilder was one of the directors really excited by the fact that censorship was breaking down. And I think in this movie you see just how perfectly things worked when it was still, you couldn't be too explicit, but so he and the writer I.A.L. Diamond were clever. And then Billy Wilder didn't have to worry about the censors, and he never made movies that were as good again. And there may not be a connection, but that tended to be true of a lot of filmmakers who were so excited for the walls of Jericho to fall down, and they did. And actually a new generation of directors really made the films that we think of as that time, a whole new generation. Before I get to any questions you may have, I just wanted to say, since this is our last time together on this series, if you missed either of the previous talks or want to watch them again, they will be available on the YouTube site for the library in a few days or weeks, so watch for those. If you want to read more about this fascinating period, these are two of my favorite books, Sin in Soft Focus by the wonderful Mark A. Vieira, the true expert on pre-code cinema, and then The Years of Joseph Breen are covered in Hollywood's Censor. If you want to see the documentary that I made on pre-code cinema that was on TCM, it's part of this DVD set, Forbidden Hollywood Volume 2, which also has some really terrific movies on it. And if you want to get in touch with me, it's very easy. I'd love to hear from you. Just contact me at mediasteven.com, Stephen with a V. And with that, could the house lights come up, please? And if anyone has thoughts or questions, yes, sir.
Did this win any awards for writing the screenplay?
I believe it did win the best screenplay for original screenplay for Wilder and Diamond, because I know that Billy Wilder took home at least 2 Oscars that night. One was as the film's producer with the Mirisch brothers, and one as its director. And really, I think it's so incredible that Billy Wilder could come from, I believe he was a native Austrian, and came to America in the 30s, taught himself English, was a great screenwriter in the 30s, started directing movies in the 40s, and directed and co-wrote Sunset Boulevard, Double Indemnity, Some Like It Hot, this film. Just an incredible amount of talent in that man, and he knew the right collaborators to work with. Any other? Yes, Steve.
So, Steve, I couldn't help but notice the casting choice. So the last time that Jack Lemmon walks into the office, in Sheldrake's office,
Mm-hmm.
there is a very different person sitting.
Yes, that's right.
What message was he?
I think was that he was temporarily changing his modus operandi there. Yes, exactly. And wasn't that a good part for Edie Adams, who was married at the time to the comedian Ernie Kovacs? And just a great, giving her those glasses at the beginning and just a little bit of a push in, at the camera, just immediately establishes her. So we're going to remember her through the film. I think Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond were also the master of callbacks, things like that. Setting things up and then surprising us, or phrases of dialogue that are cleverly repeated throughout. They were just really the best at that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the choice of black and white. What do you feel like that was made for color?
That's a very good question, because color was coming in at this time. There were still black and white major features being made, and in fact, this was one of the last black and white movies that Billy Wilder made. He directed the first movie with Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, The Fortune Cookie, in 1966, fun movie. That's in black and white also. I think as a director he liked it, and I think that he felt that color was something he mostly used for comedies at that time. He did most of his dramas in black and white, and this movie, I think, wonderfully walks that fine line between comedy and drama right to the end. He probably thought, and I'm speculating here, that tonally that the drama and the comedy would work better if they were in black and white. I know that the previous year he made Some Like It Hot in black and white, because with Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis in drag, there are color photos of them, and he just knew it would work better story-wise. Story-wise, I sound like a character in the movie. Plot-wise, picture-wise, if they were in black and white. So, and also it gave him a chance to work with one of the greatest black and white cinematographers in the history of film, a man named Joseph Lachelle, who won the Oscar for Laura in 1945. So I think that the tone of the movie was something that he thought could be more captured, the romanticism, the ruefulness, the kind of wistfulness, as well as the comedy. Thank you for asking. Yes?
What was the purpose of the very slow scene changes that we saw 3 or 4 times to fade to black and then use the field and back into the picture? Why did they do that?
Well, for me, you'll have to be more specific, because that was stylistically really the way movies were made at the time. You know, that was far. You didn't have the era of the direct cut very often in films until one of the most prominent was Lawrence of Arabia, made 2 years later, where there's that famous moment where Peter O'Toole, there's a close-up of him with a match, and he blows it out, and it just cuts to the desert, you know, without sound or anything. Orson Welles had done the kind of style that you were mentioning that we think of as much more traditional today, which was fast cuts in Citizen Kane, his very first film. He would have fun saying things like having a character say, "Merry Christmas," and then jump 20 years forward, and a different character says in a straight cut, "And a Happy New Year." And so Welles was showing us how films could be faster, you could do cutting like that, and it's fun. I always enjoy seeing movies, like musical numbers have montages that sometimes do very just straight cuts, like in On the Town, that jump from place to place. But stylistically, that was the norm in movies, to do dissolves, music. Speaking of music, that beautiful theme was actually a song from 1949, 11 years before this movie, called "Jealous Lover." And it was written for another movie and became a fairly popular record. And they determined it would be a good theme for this movie, and so they had the wonderful composer Adolf Deutsch adapt it into what was then known as, retitled, Theme from the Apartment, and it became an even bigger hit with this movie. And from time to time it was played, you heard a solo pianist, and that solo pianist was a 25-year-old musician and would-be film composer named Johnny Williams. I wonder whatever happened to him. He had many fond memories, like his father did, of working on scoring sessions as a musician before his incredible success. Yeah, he's with us at 92. So with that, if there is anything else you'd like to contact me, oh yes, in the very, very back. Wrap it all up for us. Yes. Yeah, it's an older apartment. I think the idea is, you know, he's an office schlub who is not going to have the fanciest apartment in town. But it had to be, and I know they put a lot of thought into the art direction of the movie, it had to be, as I think he describes in that narration at the beginning, I don't remember if the word was cozy, but something appealing enough to work for all of the executives, but not so fancy. Because you often see movies, especially ones set in New York now, and think, how does that person live there? I mean, how do they have that much money? So I think they were kind of taking a middle ground for story purposes. Yeah, that was why it was like that. Oscar for art direction. Thank you for the great Alexander Trauner. Well, I wanted to thank Aaron and TJ and Stephen here at the library, and I wanted to thank all of you for coming to this series. And please join me for whatever the next one is. I know they have wonderful speakers, including one next week here. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.